Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back, guys. Welcome back. I'm episode 19, starting to roll a little bit here. We're getting into the middle of March. The middle of March is actually a big week for me. I am, what day is it? The 12th? What day we got here? This is supposed to be March 12th. So March 12th, March 16th will mark the 2 years I stopped drinking booze 2 years ago this Sunday. It's an interesting date for me because it was also 5 years ago when I went full board on my company that I talk about every now and then, my last company. And so I come up on it again, March 16th. It's always the drinking thing, I didn't mean it to line up with the business endeavors years ago or anything like that around COVID. So I think COVID started, I think the date of COVID was like March 15th or 16th. I could be inaccurate on that, but I think it was when it went into in 2020, when we were doing the shutdowns. It was around there. So just like weird how it's all circulated into that date for me. I wonder what March 16th is for you guys and what this Sunday is for you guys. If you can think back to those COVID days, that will be 5 years. Essentially, when we did the shutdown, I remember the first time that I went into my place of work for COVID 5 years ago. And we all thought we were just so scary. Really, I was walking into MASH. I was working at a place called MASH Performance, MASH Baseball. And I walked into this place and everyone was just sitting around. Obviously, we weren't going to have anybody in that day. And we had a chiropractor there who was like the closest thing to a doctor that any of us had. We were just a bunch of baseball coaches. And so we were all leaning on him for advice and what was going to happen in the world. And we were so scared. We were acting like we weren't scared. I remember it was like an egotistical measurable of you and a bunch of dudes looking at each other of who was more scared than the next. And you wanted to act like you weren't that scared, right? Or nervous about what was going on. And then we left. I was living at my buddy's house at the time, and Tom Buski, and me and him were calling each other on picking up meat. And we were both at two grocery stores. And one grocery store was like all out of, I can't remember, obviously the toilet paper saga. Everyone was crushing toilet paper, and toilet paper was getting used up, which was interesting and unique. But I never understood that. I still don't, even as I say that now. But yeah, I remember we were trying to fill our fridge and our freezer with as much food as we could. It was like potatoes, beans, rice, and then as much meats as we could. And one of the places I was at was like out of food, so he was getting food, and just what a fascinating time. It really wasn't that long ago. And if you think about it, in my history, in my generation, I'm 35, I'm a millennial. Just it's an impactful time. I remember the 9/11 happened when I was a kid. I was in 7th grade, and I remember I went into school and everybody was locked in place in the classrooms, and we were all under desk and whatnot. And obviously you see movies of World War II and World War One, and you see movements that happened in the 60s and the 70s. And I'm just thinking about my lifetime, right? I mean, 9/11 was a big moment being an American. And then COVID was a world pandemic, and that was really fascinating. And I think I read, even on one of these solo pods, I read off some of my journals from around COVID. And that was actually what my intentions of today were to talk about, not about COVID. That was just what came to me right when, I don't know how that came to me, but it did. So here we are talking about it. But the thing I did want to talk about is I've got my journal here as I come to a close because I have about 3 or 4 days left in it, and then I'll go into a new journal. But I had journals out recently in one of these shows, and I was talking about writing, And this is what I really wanted to talk about today. And I'm going to try to turn my brain on. It's midday. I never do podcasts midday. It's 3:30 my time. I'm in mountain time. We just had daylight saving time, which is just one of the weirdest things of all. That's another human history, wild concept that we would change the clocks. My history is a little dusty here with how this happened, but I'm pretty sure that happened around World War One, around the clock usage, and it was all for manufacturing work and trying to extend work days, I believe. I think that's when it happened heavily, which would have been 100 years ago. And there's also some other times. That's why I'm saying my brain is a little dusty as I think about this right now in the moment. But there's also some other times around daylight saving times and how that occurred. But there was a cool, I guess cool is perspective and subjective, however you would handle that. But there's a study done. I'd have to look this up as well. But there was a study done on daylight saving times and hospital visits. And it was showing, I could get these numbers wrong. I'm going to take a swing at it. So you'll have to look this up if you're interested. But there was a study done when we lost an hour of sleep. So when we have the time of the year where we lose an hour, the hospital visits went up around 40 to 42% in that day of a lost hour of sleep. And then when we gain an hour, the hospital, and this is where I can't remember, I think it went down 20%. So just think of it as a baseline, right? And then it's kind of the same year round, and then all of a sudden the whole country loses an hour of sleep, or millions of people lose an hour of sleep, and hospital visits go up, skyrocket, into the 40 percentile. When we gain an hour of sleep, the hospital visits for that day in those days goes down. I think it was in the 20 percentile, maybe in a little bit more than 20%. So in reality, that's like a 60% swing, right, in hospital visits based off of sleep. And I don't think it's hard. I mean, sleep is our number one tool of recovery. It's a need. It's a necessity. It's a survival. And so to mess with human sleep and human biology, it's just a way in which we've altered nature and the biological clocks that we're circadian humans. I've talked about this in previous shows, but we're circadian humans. So when we mess with our circadian rhythm and our sleep schedule, it definitely makes sense to me. I'm not in the hospital business, so I don't know. I have some people I should probably talk to about that a little bit and see what their perspective around it. But it would make sense that we would see an uptick in issues with our health when we lose sleep, in opposed to when we gain sleep, right? But just something interesting to think about. Again, not what I was planning on talking about today. I never know. I'm always slightly nervous when I press start because I don't know what I'm going to talk about. I always have somewhat of an idea, but I'm going to go back to this because this morning, I had a thought, and I'm going to this journal again. I had this thought this morning about thinking, right? And something that I've been heavily on for the last couple months, especially now that I have a kid, is about school and school systems and what we should do for school, how we should be learning, what makes the most sense for our learning, our educational process. And a lot of things that come to me that make a lot of sense if I were to digest what school should look like today. And I was talking to a friend earlier. He asked me what I would do if I had a school or if I owned a school. And it'd be really simple. Honestly, I would create a nature-based system where you're heavily outdoors, and the entire school system would be, your entire schooling would be to learn how to be an entrepreneur and a creator. Because I think as corporate structures start to crumble, and as the educational system is crumbling, and all these structures that have been really sustainable for largely through the industrial age for assembly line working and the way that our systems and the fabric of our society was set up, now that all that's starting to die off and to change rapidly, to me, school would have to change with that to evolve. So the way I would evolve school is I would have it nature-based. I'd have it be outdoors, and I would allow AI to continue to be AI. So using artificial intelligence to do a lot of our thinking for us. And we already do this, right? An example I think of with this is MapQuest and Google Maps and Apple Maps now. if you're whatever age you are, think of how you've traveled since you've been born. When I was a little kid, I obviously wasn't as concerned about travel because my parents were doing that. But I remember them using maps, and my mom had an address book of everybody that we knew. So we had phone numbers and their address, and obviously you would send letters and whatnot. You worked through the mailing system. But when you would get to people's houses, if we were traveling to Florida, for example, they would use a big map of the country that had the highways on it and minor highways and roads and whatnot. And they would use a map. I remember when I was a little kid, I think we had a van, and we would drive to Florida as a family vacation. And one of the times I remember my mom had like pen marks to get from Detroit all the way down. I think it was 75. It should be Highway 75, I think. And that I think takes you all the way down to Florida, like all the way to the tip or to the Keys. And we would stop off and see my grandpa and my aunt and uncle in Florida, and we would use a map. And I just remember my mom having that in the passenger seat while my dad would drive, 2 days worth of driving, and they would use a map to physically get us down to Florida. And then I remember one time oddly, there was this guy, and I'm bummed that I don't remember this guy's name. I can see him in my mind, but he worked with my dad, and he had come to our house when I was in like middle school. And he was the first car that had a GPS on it. And I remember we could see his GPS in the TV of his car. And we drove around the neighborhood, and he was showing us. It was just like the craziest thing ever. It was like the first day we got cable. That was also pretty crazy. We couldn't wait to come home to get on to see cable television. But we drove around the neighborhood, and the GPS had these street signs, and it would say, I grew up on this street called Gill Road, and it was like as we're driving, we had this little arrow on the camera of the car, and it was our car driving on Gill Road. And then we'd turn right on 8 Mile, and you'd see 8 Mile, and then you'd see the city of Livonia. I grew up in Farmington, Michigan. Livonia was a neighboring city, and you could see all that on this GPS. I don't remember, obviously it wasn't high tech as it is now, but I remember that was like the first guy that I had ever been exposed to that had GPS in his car, and he wanted to show us so badly. He came over to our house. We all jumped in his car and drove around the block to see how this worked. And then when I was in high school, college, we used to print up MapQuest, and MapQuest would give you the checkpoints to where you were going. So you'd type the address in, print it up. My mom would print it up, hand it to me, and I would drive or be with somebody, however that worked. I don't remember exactly. And then we would talk to each other. The person in the passenger seat would be, okay, in 9 miles, turn right at this stop sign, whatever. And we would do that. And so why I'm saying all that is that now I drive to the same place regularly every day, essentially. And there's very few places I get into my car, I plug my phone in, and my phone comes up on the CarPlay in my Jeep, and I can play my music, I can make phone calls, I have my map always rolling, and I kind of have those three happening at all times. And for the most part, even places that I go to regularly that are about 25 to 30 minutes away, I always have my map on because it's telling me about traffic, it's telling me where police, whatever those speed light signs are. And so it's on. And the thing about that is it's beautiful. It's a beautiful technology in AI, but it also makes me not think. And I don't think about where I'm going anymore. I don't have to pay attention to street signs. I have no idea what streets I drive on. I don't know what they're called. I don't know how far away the mileage is. I have a rough idea, but I know that I don't have to think because I have it on my car. And so I just use as an example from when I was a child to now, how artificial intelligence that is around us all the time, it takes away thinking. Because there's no need to have to think about street signs. I don't need to know what highway is which or what direction I'm going because I have it. And it allows me to do other things like take phone calls. I don't remember my dad ripping through phone calls or people taking calls on windshield time, which is a popular phrase now, because you had to be attentive to the road and where you're traveling. And you had to know addresses. You had to know street signs, and you had to know what highway you were on. And so if I correlate that to school, okay, well, max that out and think about everything. Obviously, we don't have to think about math anymore because we have calculators and everything's accounted for that way. We don't have to really think about health anymore because we have all information, and health is equally, I don't know if process is the right word, but it's shared through the internet. You can look up anything and get access to that. I've always found that recently, I found that incredibly, maybe almost comical about how much we debate things about saunas. I mean, I don't know how many times we can just say, if you sauna 4 to 7 times, you lower all-cause mortality. I don't know how many more times we hear that, and then people share it as like aha moments, or we hear it as aha moments. It's just the same thing, right? It's just the same information. We're essentially just trying to out information each other. But the point is that all information is accessible through AI now. And so if I have a school, well, then how much information should I be lobbying for if everything's already generated? It would purely come off of my own questioning or curiosity, and I could essentially program everything and put it together and learn it online today on my own. It just comes into how much time do you want to put into it. I said this with Mitch Haniger, which I think this is a Naval quote. Education is expensive, learning is cheap. But it really is just the time and effort you put into learning. You can learn anything at this point. You can learn anything you want. You don't have to have a degree in anything. You have access to all education. And so if you scale that out to schools and you scale that out to the educational process, well, then what's the point of learning certain subjects from a teacher or having to go somewhere or pay for anything or do anything, because you already have access to that? So now if I think of school, okay, well, then what would be the point of school? I would create a system that teaches you how to be an entrepreneur as the corporate systems begin to collapse, and generate your own income, and start by doing that at early ages. You can use the same emperor style that Germany had hundreds of years ago, where they created an assembly line and military forces from age 7 to 14, essentially. Just look at school of being 7 to 17. And ideally, you'd put 10 years into studying and learning. And by age 18, you'd have your business rolling, sustainable. You'd already been planting all those seeds for 10 years. And then by the time you're an 18-year-old, you're fully immersed into your business, your career, which is no different than how people created the trades. Or maybe you need to go to college a little bit longer, or you need to do something a little bit more, but you're still in the same thing. You just essentially created your own corporate line. You can run your business out from 18 to 65 if you want, and generate enough income and retire, whatever that looks like. Retirement's always been an odd thing to me to begin with. That's never made sense to me. It's never made sense to me to live life to retire and shut that down. It just, I don't know what that means. I still don't know what that means. But if I'm schooling myself, I'm thinking about it like that. How do you create an educational system that teaches people to bring their own unique skills, their childhood imagination, which we've been talking a lot about, and start developing that around age 7 over the course of 10 years? So you're teaching everybody about taxes, the current landscape of economy. You're teaching about the hierarchy of government, how rules established. You're teaching about how to run a business, how to understand the forms and the way to do this in capitalism, which is where America is. So how do you create individual entrepreneurs that provide product and service that helps the economy run itself? And then essentially you create this new creator lifestyle. It's for people to generate their own resources and also provide for the greater cause, the whole. So that to me would be the only educational side. That would be the only thing you'd be doing in an actual classroom, is learning those subjects about how the world works. And you would funnel into what you creatively are becoming or wanting. But I would be teaching people about that, and that would be kind of the classroom, like in a class. And then outside of that, I would do two things that are outside of the classroom. And one is self-sustaining. So looking at it as gardening, building shelter, essentially creating your own ability, throat dried up there, creating your own ability to gather your own resources. And then the second one would be self-regulatory, which seems to be a massive things from my generation and below because of the modern landscape, the way that we are now generally. And so self-regulatory, in my opinion, should be the majority of your educational process as a young kid all the way up to adulthood. Self-regulatory being, how do you regulate your own nervous system? And there's so many ways to do that. I know that I get kind of pinned as a breathing specialist, which is always odd to me, the word specialist in anything, but I know that I can get pinned as breathing specialist and thinking that self-regulation only happens from breathing. That's not true. There's a ridiculous amount of things to self-regulate your nervous system. But that's where I think the next wave of people are going to have to learn how to educate themselves, because AI is going to handle all of your education. It's going to handle all of your intellect and your needing to know. It's going to give you all the information that's already accessible. So if it's already accessible and we created AI to be able to access that, why wouldn't we capitalize on that and do what we can uniquely do for the economy? So why wouldn't we train and teach people to be entrepreneurs and learn how the world works, the economy works, how your business and product and service works and provides? And then that would, like I said, that would be like your testing, if you will. That's how you get tested. And you could also be building something from an early age and have that when you're older. It's like a resource thing. And then everything out that's outside. So if you cut the day, I think you only need to do that for like 3 hours or so. You can do that indoors for 3 hours. That's kind of on the whiteboard, if you will, metaphorically. And you're doing that type of schooling. And then the other, if we need to have people away for 7 hours, you use an hour for individual time, whatever that is, lunch, rest, relaxation, recess, fine. But then the other 3 hours is self-regulation teaching and resource teaching. So how to garden and how to self-regulate. And that would be what my school system would look like. And if I go back to finalize this show, and I pull up my journal one more time, a lot of why my thoughts have been around this recently is because of the lack of thinking that I find in conversation in the real world, in the third dimension. I don't think that I'm unique in thinking that. I think that's like if you walk around the street, if you go to a grocery store and you ask people if they have great conversations all day, I think you'd have majority of that would say no, as opposed to yes. And that would be a fascinating collection of data anyways, it'd have to be subjective, I would think. But how much of your conversation throughout the day is below the surface, right? Is in-depth conversation. I think that's becoming very difficult because it's really hard to maintain attention and presence and listening and listen to other people. And then on top of that, it's really hard to even understand what you think at this point. So how do you communicate to other people and how do you even listen to them? And it's just kind of, if you think of your conversations, a lot of them are patterned. You're doing your time of talking while no one's listening to you. And then when they start talking, you're not listening to them. And so it's really, if you're like a third party and you just watch two people communicate, it's really like one person just shares their story while the other person shares their story. And then both people disperse and nothing really happened. And so writing in my journal, I think the reason why journaling has become so therapeutic and has become a modality for therapy, it's not that it's more of the fact that because when you access thinking, it has to be therapeutic because of how much we don't think. Going back to the map, my parents were thinking from Detroit all the way to Florida. So the drive from the north all the way down to the south required conscious thought. That in and of itself had to have been fatiguing, but it also had to have been euphoric because it had to have felt like dopamine and an accomplishment. And that seems to be something that everyone is tagging along on right now as well, is our lack of dopamine. How is that not dopamine to get yourself to the next checkpoint on a journey or an exploration or adventure phase while you're thinking? And every time you see yourself get across the border to Ohio or Kentucky to Tennessee and down through the Carolinas into Georgia, how is that not? That's got to feel like a dopamine hit. I mean, I think it does already still with having your GPS on, but I think it would be more. I can't remember. I was young, but I feel like it had to have been deeper connection to dopamine when we had to consciously solve all these things and think all these things, right? And think about when you were able to store phone numbers in your brain and people's addresses in your brain. I don't even know my wife's phone number at this point. And when I was a kid, I knew all my closest friends' phone numbers by heart, and I could pick up the phone and type their numbers in. And so think about that. That was, 30 years ago, and I had access to that retention of thought in order to communicate with people. And so I think that's why journaling has become so difficult for people now. And journaling is perceived as this thing that's really hard to do. And most often when I talk to people, they say they don't know how to journal or what to do when they journal. And they always give me such an odd look when I say to them, just write your thoughts. And for whatever reason, I had to step back from that question or that experience that I've had so often today. And I had to think about that, because the paradox of that I came to was maybe I'm asking the wrong question or I'm suggesting the wrong thing when I say to someone, just write your thoughts, and they go, I don't know how to do that. Instead of me being more frustrated or just like, just do it. Just do it. I think the issue that I came to this morning was realizing, no, that would make a lot of sense. Because if you have a mass population of people who no longer have to retain information or no longer have to think, then yeah, journaling is going to be really difficult. You don't know what you think. You don't know what your thoughts are, where they're coming from. So being able to sit down and fill a page on a journal, it made a little bit more sense to me this morning as to why that seems to be A, therapeutic, but B, almost a non-conforming thing. You don't find many people out there journaling. You see them every now and then, a coffee shop or a library, bookstore. You'll see someone ripping a journal, but you don't see it often. And I wonder if people were able to journal aggressively 50 years ago, 100 years ago. I mean, people who are still alive in their 80s or 90s or 70s, what was it like? Were people journaling when you were a kid? It'd be nice to talk to people 200 years ago, and were they journaling? And that's sort of the things that this book, Lessons of History, right here actually, said that a lot of what came from democracy actually in the modern landscape was a debasement of art. That it's still subjective, but art has started to demise and decrease. And is that because we don't think as much? And that can make sense with some of the poetic stuff that came out, 500 years ago. Look at the Renaissance age and look at people who were able to paint and write and think, and the classical music that came out of those sort of times. Just something that I've been thinking about and chewing on. So I wanted to hop on here and talk about it a little bit. But I don't know. Think about it. Maybe try to drive an hour tomorrow or the next day and not use your map and see if you know how to get there. I don't know. Maybe you guys do already. But enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.